All right, let's dive right into this explainer, and we're kicking things off with a pretty wild paradox. Today, we're going to apply the cold, complex, completely rigorous math of systems engineering to the messy, unpredictable reality of human relationships. We usually think of love as this elusive, poetic force, right? But what if the success or failure of a marriage could actually be plotted out on a graph? What if infidelity isn't always some dramatic crime of passion, but just a predictable glitch in a closed mathematical system? Well, that is exactly what we're unpacking today.
Here is our roadmap for understanding how couples succeed and why they fail. We are going to hit the paradox of love, map out the literal math of marriage, identify 3 specific interaction styles, calculate emotional costs, and finally, answer the big question, why happy people cheat.
So, Section 1. The paradox of love. Happy, yet cheating. Let's completely shatter the romanticized script we usually follow when we talk about betrayal.
Based on a fascinating study published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, we are hit with a reality that completely rewrites our assumptions. The traditional narrative tells us that affairs only happen in broken, miserable relationships where the love has completely died. But the data shows something entirely different. People who describe themselves as satisfied, people who explicitly stated they still love their spouses, well, they cheated anyway. And incredibly, many reported they didn't even regret it. As social psychologist Dylan Selterman notes, moral consistency is very, very tricky.
And if you're thinking, okay, that's just a handful of weird anomalies, think again. This study looked at nearly 2,000 people who sought affairs through a dating site. 2,000! This absolutely proves we need a fundamentally better framework to understand why this happens. Because if it's not always a lack of love, what on earth is it?
That brings us to Section 2, the math of marriage, specifically optimal control theory. To build that better framework, we're actually heading to the Applied Mathematics Department at the University of Washington.
Instead of looking at love purely through a psychological lens, we can actually view a marriage as a biological and economic system. Applied mathematicians use this exact framework, optimal control theory, to map out the absolute best strategies for a couple to maximize their shared happiness. In this model, you and your partner are constantly adjusting your responses to one another. You're acting as control variables to achieve a mutual goal over time.
When mathematicians map out the emotional costs within a marriage, they create an adjoint space. This space reveals optimal trajectories, these mathematical vectors that couples naturally trend toward as they navigate their own emotional equations. Every single interaction, every response, pulls the marital system along these lines. It brilliantly proves that a marriage isn't just a series of random, isolated events. It's a deeply dynamic system that is constantly seeking a state of equilibrium.
Which leads us to Section 3, 3 interaction styles. So, what are the actual real-world solutions to these complex marital equations? Decades of psychological research by Dr. John Gottman revealed 3 specific, mathematically stable interaction styles. First, you have validating couples. They interact and support each other through both positive and negative emotions. Second, conflict-avoiding couples, who only interact when things are sunny and just withdraw when things get negative. And third, volatile couples. They have these huge, passionate fights in the negative range, but kind of ignore each other when things are positive. And here is the crazy part. Researchers prove that these styles aren't just psychological habits. They are the literal, mathematical solutions to the optimal control problem of a relationship.
But how do couples actually arrive at these different styles? According to the mathematical models, it literally all comes down to a variable representing emotional cost. When spouses balance the benefit of joint happiness with the actual emotional effort required to get there, the math yields a nonlinear solution, which is the validating style. But what happens when couples mathematically ignore the emotional cost parameter entirely? Well, the math shifts to linear optimization, and the system naturally defaults to that extremely common conflict-avoiding style. They basically just ignore their spouse when the spouse is negative to avoid the emotional toll.
Moving to Section 4, bids and emotional costs. Let's talk about what this emotional cost actually feels like in the real world of daily psychology, because it's something we experience every single day. Dr. Gottman found that the real currency of a marriage system comes down to something he calls bids. Now, a bid is essentially a micro-investment. It's a passing glance, a quick comment about the weather, maybe an invitation to look at a funny video on a phone. It is one partner quietly reaching out for attention, affection, or support. And every single time a bid is made, the other partner has to spend a tiny amount of emotional energy, an emotional cost, to respond to it. So what happens when a conflict-avoiding couple mathematically optimizes to avoid emotional costs, and they consistently ignore these bids? Well, there are no obvious fights, there's zero surface tension. From the outside, it looks like a perfectly peaceful, happy relationship. But beneath the surface, there is this slow, silent accumulation of missed moments. One partner repeatedly feels completely unseen. The system quietly and invisibly erodes, draining one partner's emotional tank without a single argument ever taking place.
And this invisible erosion brings us perfectly to Section 5, Why Happy People Cheat, the ultimate system glitch. When we dig into the data from the Journal of Sex Research, we find a truth that completely defies all those Hollywood stereotypes about cheating. Sexual desire? It isn't the whole story. For a lot of people, it's not even the main story. Actually, the vast majority of physical contact reported in these affairs was just kissing and cuddling. Intercourse only happened about 50% of the time.
So what are they actually looking for then? An affair, for so many people, is way less about a body and much more about a feeling they are chasing. When a couple adopts that conflict-avoiding mathematical style, where they just stop paying the emotional cost to respond to daily bids, one partner eventually feels entirely invisible. They step outside the marriage not because they hate their spouse or because their life is miserable, but simply to feel seen again. They just want a bid answered.
Plus, we really have to look at the internal psychology of the individuals in the system. Psychotherapist Moshe Ratson points out that some people actively sabotage their own mathematically stable relationship. And why do they do that? It often stems from low self-esteem, poor emotional regulation, and this deep internal restlessness. For someone who grew up around trauma or chaos, a stable, perfectly calm relationship can actually feel unnatural and unnerving. A part of them might subconsciously work against that stability, introducing chaos simply because it feels more comfortable to them than the quiet.
And this brings us to the core synthesis of our explainer today. A relationship can absolutely achieve mathematical stability on paper. You can have a flawlessly optimized, conflict-free system where two people live together in total peace. But if the emotional costs are constantly bypassed and those daily bids for connection are ignored, one partner is going to experience severe psychological restlessness in reality. The math works, but the human being breaks. Asking were they even happy after an affair is often the completely wrong question, because the system can appear perfectly happy right up until the literal moment it shatters.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to reflect on for your own interactions. Every time your partner makes a bid for your attention, there is a choice to be made and an emotional cost to be paid. Are you actively optimizing those emotional costs in your own relationship equations to build a validating system? Or are you just defaulting to avoiding conflict and ignoring the bids? Because as both the math and the psychology show us, the cost of paying attention is incredibly small, but the cost of ignoring it can eventually bring the entire system crashing down. Think about that the next time someone reaches out across the dinner table.